The teller looked at me over the top of her glasses, and something in her expression made my hand stop halfway to the counter. "Mrs. Patterson," she said quietly, her voice dropping below the ambient hum of the branch. "I need you to step away from the wicket for a moment, please. Just come with me to the back office." I had been standing at that counter for less than 90 seconds. I had driven myself across Calgary in the middle of a February snowstorm, the kind that turns the Deerfoot into a parking lot, because my nephew had told me this transfer needed to happen today, before end of business. No exceptions. I had my coat still buttoned, my purse strap still over my shoulder, and I was holding a handwritten note with a routing number in Tyler's handwriting. "Is something wrong with my account?" I asked. The teller, whose name tag said Sophia, glanced toward the front doors of the branch, then back at me. "Not with your account, no. But I need 5 minutes of your time in private. Can you do that for me?" There was something in her voice I couldn't name. Not alarm exactly, but close to it. The kind of tone people use when they're trying very hard to stay calm and are not entirely succeeding. I followed her. "Let me go back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense without it. My husband Gerald died 19 months before that February afternoon. Pancreatic cancer. We had 38 years together, raised our daughter Rebecca, built a life in the same house in Arbor Lake that we bought when the neighborhood was still being graded. Gerald was the kind of man who fixed things before they broke, who kept every receipt in a binder by year, who knew our mortgage interest rate to 3 decimal places. When he died, I lost my husband and I lost the person who had always made sense of the financial side of our life. Those 2 losses felt almost equal in size, and I'm still not entirely sure how to feel about that. Rebecca lives in Halifax. She moved there 12 years ago for her residency and never left. She's a pediatrician now, married to a man I genuinely like, with 2 kids I see twice a year if I'm lucky. We talk every Sunday. She wanted me to move east after Gerald passed, but Halifax felt like surrender somehow. My house, my neighbors, my doctor, my garden, everything familiar was here. I told her I was fine. I told her that a lot. Tyler is the son of my late sister Patricia. Patricia died of a stroke 4 years ago, and after that Tyler and I had grown closer out of shared grief. He was 34, worked in commercial real estate in Edmonton, drove down to Calgary every few weeks to check on me. In the months after Gerald's funeral, he was suddenly there, constantly helping me sort through Gerald's papers, taking me to appointments, cooking dinner on Sundays. I was grieving and I was lonely, and I told myself that this was what family did for each other. I gave him enduring power of attorney 8 months after Gerald died. He suggested it, gently, over coffee at my kitchen table. He brought the forms himself, already printed. "Auntie Eleanor, it's just a precaution," he said. "If anything ever happened to you, someone needs to be able to act quickly. You don't want the courts involved." He had Amber with him that day, his girlfriend, who sat with her hands folded and her eyes moving slowly around my kitchen as though she were taking inventory. I thought she was just quiet. I didn't understand then that she was calculating. I signed the forms. I trusted him completely. He was Patricia's son. Back in Sophia's office, which was really just a small room with a round table and 2 chairs, she closed the door and sat across from me and folded her hands the way people do when they have to say something difficult. "Mrs. Patterson, I flagged your account this morning before you came in. The transfer your nephew arranged by phone yesterday, the one you're here to authorize in person, today it's for $87,000. That would bring the total amount moved out of your accounts in the past 14 months to just over $280,000. The number didn't land right away. It sat in front of me like something in a language I almost spoke. "That can't be right," I said. "I've printed the statements." She slid a folder across the table. The withdrawals started small. A few hundred here, a couple thousand there. Then larger amounts transferred to 2 accounts. One in your nephew's name and one in his girlfriend's maiden name. I opened the folder. The numbers were very clear. "He has power of attorney," I said, because I needed to say something, and that was the only fact I could find. "He does," Sophia said carefully, "but an enduring power of attorney doesn't authorize someone to use your assets for their own benefit. It authorizes them to act on your behalf, in your interest. What I'm looking at here is not consistent with acting in your interest." She paused. "Mrs. Patterson, I've also been in contact this morning with the Office of the Public Guardian and Trustee. They have a financial abuse hotline, and they've been made aware of the pattern on your account. An investigator called me back within the hour. I looked at her. How long have you been watching this? I flagged it 6 weeks ago when the amounts increased. I needed to document the pattern before I could act. I'm sorry it took this long. I'm sorry you're sitting here right now. Why didn't you call me? She looked at me steadily. Your nephew called the branch last week to update the contact preferences on your account. He changed the primary contact number to his own. The room went very quiet. I sat there for a moment thinking about the transfer I had almost completed. $87,000 that Tyler had told me was going into a protected investment vehicle, something to do with shielding assets from estate taxes. He had explained it for 20 minutes on the phone, and by the end I had understood approximately nothing, which he assured me was normal, which he assured me was why I needed him. There's something else, Sophia said, and her voice had shifted again. I need to ask if you've had any conversations recently with Tyler about your living situation, about whether you might need more support at home, or about a place called Cedarwood Memory and Wellness. The name stopped me cold. Cedarwood. Tyler had mentioned it once, 2 months ago, offhandedly over dinner. There's a beautiful facility in the Southwest End, Auntie. Very high-end, more like a hotel than a care home. Some people go there just for the social programs, not because they need full care or anything. I went and picked up a brochure for you, just so you'd have information. He'd left the brochure on my counter. I had put it in the recycling without reading it. How do you know about Cedarwood? I asked. Because an employee there contacted our branch's senior protection liaison 3 days ago. She said a man had come in asking very specific questions about the intake process for a client who would be, in her words, resistant to the idea. He wanted to know if a cognitive assessment could be initiated by a family member with power of attorney, and whether the voluntary admission form could be presented as part of a routine financial document package. I heard myself say, he was going to put me in a memory care facility. That's what we believe. Once you were admitted, even voluntarily, even temporarily, he would have full legal justification to act on your behalf under the power of attorney. Your house is assessed at $1.1 million. In the current Calgary market, it could sell in under 2 weeks. Gerald's house. Our house. The one with the garden he built and the basement he finished himself and the kitchen we renovated the year Rebecca got into medical school because we were so happy we needed to do something with our hands. I sat in that small office with the folder of bank statements on the table in front of me, and I felt something I can only describe as the ground dropping out from under every assumption I had made about the last 19 months. Every Sunday dinner, every drive to the pharmacy, every "I'm just looking out for you, Auntie, you know that." All of it rearranged itself in my mind into something completely different. I found an email a week after that conversation in the bank, when the RCMP financial crimes investigator showed me what had been recovered from Tyler's devices. The email was from Amber to her sister, dated the same week as Gerald's memorial service. It said, "The house alone is worth over $1 million. We just have to be patient and keep her close. Tyler knows what he's doing. Patient. For 19 months, patient through the Sunday dinners and the pharmacy runs and the gentle suggestions about how hard it must be to manage everything alone. I have a particular memory from the weeks after Gerald died. Tyler came over and he sat in Gerald's chair in the living room, not on the sofa, not at the kitchen table, but in the specific armchair where Gerald had read every evening for 30 years, and he said, 'You must be so overwhelmed, Auntie. I want you to know that I'm here.' And I had cried, and he had patted my hand, and I had felt, for the first time in weeks, slightly less alone. He sat in Gerald's chair on purpose. I'm certain of it now. Sophia walked me out of that private office and into the branch manager's office, where a woman named Diane had already pulled up my full account history and had the office of the public guardian on speakerphone. 2 hours later, a plainclothes RCMP officer arrived and asked if I would be willing to make a statement. I said yes before she finished the sentence. I called Rebecca from Diane's office with the door closed. She answered on the first ring, the way she always does when she sees my name. "Mom? Is everything okay?" "No," I said. "But I need you to listen and not panic until I finish." I heard her inhale. I heard her hold it. I told her everything. When I finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough that I said her name twice. "I knew something was wrong," she finally said, and her voice was absolutely controlled in that way she has, the doctor's voice, the voice she uses when the news is bad and panic won't help anyone. "Last summer when I suggested you come stay with us for August, and Tyler talked you out of it. He said Halifax would be too hard on your joints in the humidity." "Your joints, Mom. You run 5 kilometers 3 times a week." "I know. And at Christmas when I asked to look over your investment summary and you said Tyler had reorganized everything and you'd get me the paperwork later." "He never gave it to me," I said. I forgot to follow up. "He counted on that." Her voice cracked on the last word, just slightly. "Mom, I'm booking a flight. I'll be there by tomorrow afternoon." "You have patience." "Mom." "Okay," I said. "Okay." The next 6 hours are mostly a blur of conference rooms and polite, careful questions. The RCMP investigator, Constable Moreau, was a woman in her late 30s who spoke slowly and made sure I understood each question before I answered it. She showed me documents. She showed me the transfer history. She showed me a text message from Tyler to Amber, sent the morning of the day I had driven to the bank, that said simply, "Today's the last one. After this, it's done." Constable Moreau drove me to a hotel near the University District that evening. She explained that my house was temporarily a secondary evidence site and that an officer would escort me there the following morning to collect medications and essentials. She also explained that Tyler had been contacted, that he had a lawyer, and that charges were being prepared. "What charges?" I asked. "Fraud over $5,000, breach of fiduciary duty, and criminal misuse of a power of attorney. If we can establish the Cedarwood element with sufficient evidence, there may be additional charges related to the attempted deprivation of liberty." She paused. "Mrs. Patterson, I want you to know that the Financial Consumer Agency of Canada has seen cases like this resolved with full or near full recovery of assets. The money hasn't been spent. Most of it is sitting in accounts we've already frozen." "My house?" "Still in your name. The transfer he was preparing to make you stop that today by coming into the branch." I thought about the snowstorm I'd driven through. I thought about how I'd almost called Tyler to say I'd go in tomorrow instead, and he'd said no. Today. It has to be today. I understood now why it had to be today. I lay in the hotel room that night and did not sleep. I looked at the ceiling and I went back through 19 months of memories and tried to separate what was real from what was performance. The grief dinners and the pharmacy runs and the Sunday afternoons, had any of it been genuine? Had any part of him felt something real when Gerald died, when Patricia died, or had I always just been the house and the accounts and the patience required to access them? I don't know the answer. I'm not sure I ever will. I'm not sure it matters. Rebecca arrived the following afternoon with her carry-on and her fierce, quiet efficiency. She came through the hotel room door, dropped her bag, and held me for a long time without saying anything. Then she pulled back and looked at my face with the expression she uses when she's assessing something, and she said, "You look terrible, and also somehow stronger than you did at Christmas." "I feel both of those things," I said. She had already, on the flight from Halifax, spoken to a lawyer who specialized in elder law in Alberta. She had already left a message with a forensic accountant. She had already emailed her husband to handle school pickups for the next 2 weeks. Rebecca has always been the person in a crisis who makes 3 phone calls while everyone else is still processing the fact that there is a crisis. "Tyler called me," she said, sitting at the small hotel table with her coffee. "This morning. He said there had been a misunderstanding and that he needed to explain his side." "What did you say?" "I told him that I was a mandatory reporter as a physician and that anything he said to me that suggested criminal activity I would be legally obligated to report." He hung up. I almost laughed. Almost. The legal process took 7 months. It moved the way legal processes do, in increments, with long silences between each step, with documents that required signatures and hearings that required presence, and depositions that required sitting in a room and being asked the same questions in 12 different ways. The enduring power of attorney was revoked within the first week. Rebecca and I sat with the forensic accountant and traced every transaction, every transfer, every small withdrawal going back to the month after Gerald's memorial. It took 11 hours, spread across 3 days. At the end of it, the accountant leaned back and said, "He was careful but not careful enough. They rarely are." The hardest part was not the courtroom. The hardest part was a Saturday morning 3 months into the process, when I was in my kitchen making coffee and I looked at the chair in the living room, Gerald's chair, and I couldn't sit in it. I stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at it and thought about Tyler sitting there, and I couldn't separate the memory of my nephew from the memory of my husband, and I started crying in a way I hadn't since the week after the funeral. My neighbor Margaret, who had known me for 22 years, had started coming over twice a week since everything came out. She brought things on the pretense of needing to deliver them: a jar of her preserved tomatoes, a book she'd finished, a piece of mail that had been delivered to her box by mistake. She was never there for more than an hour, never pressed me to talk about anything I didn't want to talk about, and always left the kitchen exactly as she found it. One morning she came in and found me standing in the doorway looking at the chair, and she didn't say a word. She went to the kitchen and made coffee and brought it to me, and we stood there together in the doorway, and eventually I sat down at the kitchen table instead of the living room, and she sat across from me, and neither of us spoke for a long time. That was the moment I understood that what Tyler had stolen from me was not just money. He had taken the safe feeling I had when I was in my own home. He had taken the uncomplicated version of the last 19 months. He had taken the clear line between grief and manipulation and left me unable to tell which feelings had been real and which had been the product of a carefully managed performance. That was the theft I had no idea how to account for. I sold Gerald's chair in the spring. I bought a different one, a reading chair in a deep teal that Gerald would have called absurd and that I love completely. I planted the garden 2 weeks earlier than usual, and I talked to it the entire time, which is something I've done for 40 years, and which Gerald pretended to find embarrassing, and which I know for a fact he found comforting. I signed up for a financial management course at Mount Royal University. I sat in a classroom on Tuesday evenings and learned to read investment statements and understand account structures and identify the specific signs of financial mismanagement. The course was taught by a woman in her 60s named Paulette, who had been a certified financial planner for 30 years and who was funny in a dry, unhurried way that I responded to immediately. Paulette became a friend. She introduced me to 3 other women in the course. We still have dinner together once a month. Tyler was convicted on all counts. He received a sentence of 4 years in a federal institution. Amber received 2 years less a day, which meant provincial custody. The court ordered restitution. I recovered $263,000 of the $280,000 that had been taken. The remaining $17,000 had been spent on things that could not be recovered. I have chosen not to think very hard about what those things were. Sophia came to my house for tea in the autumn, on a Saturday. She had stayed in touch through the legal process, checking in every few weeks. And when the conviction came through, she sent me a card with a single sentence inside. "You did this." She was right that I did it. But she had started it, and I needed her to understand that. We sat in my kitchen, which I had repainted in March in a color called Morning Fog that I find consistently calming, and I asked her the same question I'd been wanting to ask since February. "Why did you look twice?" "At my account. I mean, you must see hundreds of accounts every week." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "My father is in a memory care facility in Lethbridge. He's been there for 3 years. Before he went in, my brother had power of attorney. My brother is a good man, and he was scrupulous, absolutely scrupulous, about every single dollar, and I still sat with him twice a year and went through every statement because I needed to see it with my own eyes." She looked at the table. "I know what the pattern looks like when someone is being careful. I know what it looks like when something is wrong. With your accounts, something was wrong. You protected a stranger because of your father," I said. "Someone has to look," she said. Rebecca moved back to Calgary in the spring of the following year. Her practice in Halifax had a colleague ready to take on her patient roster, and the Alberta College of Physicians and Surgeons had a straightforward reciprocity process. She told me she wasn't moving back because she thought I needed supervision. "I'm moving back because I missed you," she said, "and because my kids are growing up knowing their grandmother from video calls and 2 visits a year, and that's not enough. I am 64 now. I run 3 times a week along the pathway by the reservoir, and I talk to Gerald while I run, which I am aware sounds unusual and which I have decided I don't care about at all. My grandchildren have keys to my house. Paulette and I are planning a trip to Prince Edward Island in July. Margaret's preserved tomatoes are in my pantry. I volunteer on Saturdays with a seniors financial protection program run through the city. I sit across from people in a church meeting room and I look at their bank statements with them and I help them understand what they're looking at. Last month I sat with a woman named Grace who was 71 and whose son-in-law had recently begun managing her accounts to simplify things. We went through 3 months of statements together. By the end of the hour, Grace was very quiet in the way that means understanding, not confusion. I know the signs now. The sudden attentiveness after a loss. The isolation disguised as concern. You don't want to bother Rebecca. She's so busy. The gradual transfer of financial control presented as relief. The hurry. Always the hurry. Always some reason that the papers need to be signed today. The transfer needs to happen today. It can't wait. Trust me. The hurry is always the tell. Genuine care doesn't need a deadline. I think about the morning I drove to the bank through the snow because Tyler said it couldn't wait. I think about how close I came to standing at that wicket and completing the transfer and walking back out to my car and driving home, and not understanding until much later, perhaps until it was too late, what had almost happened. One decision. One moment of Sophia looking up from her screen and choosing to say something instead of processing a transaction. I carry that with me now. The absolute smallness of the hinge moment. How close the two outcomes were to each other. I'm not the same person who sat in that kitchen 8 months after her husband's funeral and signed forms she didn't fully understand because she was grieving and lonely, and someone she loved sat across from her and said, "This is for your protection." I don't mean that person was foolish. I mean, she was human, and humans in grief will reach for what feels like safety even when safety is exactly what's being taken from them. What I know now, and what I would say to anyone listening who sees themselves in any part of this story, you are allowed to ask for the documents in writing. You are allowed to take a week to review anything before signing. You are allowed to have a second person, someone with no financial interest in your situation, look at anything that involves your accounts, your house, your assets. You are allowed to call your bank directly and ask them to walk you through every transaction in the last 6 months. You are allowed to say, "I need time" to anyone who tells you there is no time. Anyone who loves you will understand that. Anyone who doesn't understand it, that is the thing you needed to know. Sophia came to the anniversary dinner I hosted last November. So did Constable Moreau and Paulette and Margaret and Rebecca and the kids and Rebecca's husband and Paulette's wife. We ate at the long table in the dining room, the one Gerald and I bought at a sale in Inglewood in 1998. And I looked at the faces around it and I felt something I had not expected to feel, which was completeness. Not despite what happened. Because of what came after it. The family I was born into let me down in a way I still don't entirely have language for. The family I found afterward showed up for me in ways that I will carry to the end of my life. I think that's worth saying plainly, without softening it. Blood is not the same thing as loyalty. Love is not the same thing as reliability. Trust is something that gets built over time, in ordinary moments, in the choice to show up when it would be easier not to, in the decision to say something when silence would cost you nothing and cost someone else everything. Sophia could have processed the transfer and gone on with her day. She didn't. I'm here because she looked up from her screen. That's what I think about when I'm running along the reservoir in the early morning. When the city is quiet, and the light on the water is doing that particular thing, it does in the mountains, just before the sun fully clears the ridge. I think about the people who looked up, who said something, who stayed. Find those people, keep them close. And if you're ever the person at the wicket, the person with the information, the person who sees something that doesn't sit right, please, say something. You never know who's on the other side of that moment, standing in their winter coat, holding a handwritten note with a routing number, about to lose everything they have. Tell me in the comments, have you or someone you love ever experienced something like this? And where in Canada are you watching from? I'm always moved by how many of us have faced this in our own families, and how many of us have found that the people who save us are often the ones we never expected.